the 7 deadly sins. They exist in each of us.
These are death-dealing sins. They will have a severely damaging effect on one's spiritual life.
Lust, envy, gluttony, sloth, greed, anger, and pride. According to Christian theology, committing these deadly sins is as simple as thinking about them.
Scripture says the wages of sin is death.
Each of these sins has a secret history, revealing how they came to be deadly. The 7 deadly sins have had an enormous impact on history, society, and our souls.
You cannot transgress God's moral law without someone paying a terrible price.
And the sin that wants what others have is envy. The 7 deadly sins are not in the Bible. They were originally written by a monk named Evagrius Ponticus, more than 300 years after the death of Jesus. Evagrius created a list of 8 terrible temptations to mankind's soul. In 590 AD, Pope Gregory the Great narrowed the list to 7 sins and labeled them deadly. The 7 deadly sins would guide Christian theology for the next 1400 years. For centuries, Christians have risked damnation by committing any one of the 7 deadly sins. But each sin has its own unique temptation, like envy.
Envy has to do with perceiving something that someone else has or a quality that another individual possesses. And this is the important point, either wanting it for yourself or wanting that they not have it.
On the church list, the sin of envy appears as invidia, Latin for looking with malice. The church took invidia from the name of the ancient Roman goddess of envy. Around 8 AD, the writer Ovid tells of her living in a filthy cave, eating vipers, hating the gods on Mount Olympus.
Envy is about resenting others because they have something you don't.
The goddess Envy poisons everything good. When she prowls the earth in search of victims, flowers and crops die beneath her feet. Envy spreads her poison throughout her victims' blood, bones, and brain.
You get this burning sensation of, ugh, like, why does everybody else have more than I have? And you're fixated on it, and you start to almost feel bad about yourself.
The gods of Olympus despise envy. And today, envy is the one deadly sin that even sinners don't like to mention.
People were happy to talk about gluttony and lust and joke around about it and tell stories and read the scientific literature. But envy elicits discomfort. Envy, more than any other sin, I think, seems to reflect a human failing that we're disturbed by.
The sin of envy can be confused with jealousy. But jealousy is often a fear of losing a loved one to someone else. Envy is different.
because you have something that I don't possess, and I hate you for it.
It could be a material thing, it could be a position, it could be a place, etc., etc.
And what envy can't possess, it destroys.
One of our priests used to, in illustrating the notion of envy, say that the way to have the greenest lawn on your block is not to go through all the trouble of using lawn food on your own lawn, but to simply go out and pour gasoline on your neighbor's lawn.
It's possible that some crimes are motivated by envy, certain cases of vandalism, just so the other person can't have the thing that the envious person lacks.
Vienna, Austria, 1791. Antonio Salieri was one of the most successful composers of his day. He was celebrated, admired, and even envied. But did this man of talent envy a man of genius named Mozart?
In the letters from Mozart to his father, he mentions that the court composers in Vienna were contentious and that there was resentment at others' success, and that some of them were circulating rumors to try and diminish the reputation of others and the recognition that they were getting.
If you become consumed by envy, and it's a consuming effect, it can overwhelm all of your thoughts and your conduct.
It causes one to want the other person's demise.
When Mozart died at the age of 36, rumors swirled that he had been poisoned by the envious Salieri.
Historians do not accept the idea that Salieri was responsible for Mozart's death. Why this story resonates today is probably because we can all accept the idea that there probably is a fairly thin social veneer that covers professional rivalry, and it wouldn't take much to have people be unmasked and reveal their animosity.
According to some theologians, the sin of envy bedeviled humanity from the beginning of time. Some Christians believe that Satan was expelled from heaven because he envied Adam and Eve.
Satan is ultimately refusing to regard humanity in favorable terms and is driven from heaven. And Satan may envy humanity so much because humanity has the potential to be united with God in eternity that Satan sets out to trip us up.
Later tradition would talk about the serpent trying to encourage Adam and Eve to want something they did not have that God did have, namely immortality. And sometimes that is seen as being envy.
There's little doubt that Adam and Eve's first child was possessed by the sin of envy.
Cain and Abel are asked to make offerings to the Lord, and Abel's gift was better in the eyes of the Lord. And the book of Genesis is very explicit about Cain's reaction. His face falls.
Cain feels wounded, and instead of repairing himself, which is what a healthy person does, he looks at someone who got something he didn't. And this may be, in fact, at the root of the sinfulness of envy. Instead of improving yourself, you seek to destroy another.
And as a result, he takes his brother out into the field and murders him. And it is envy that motivates the first murder in the book of Genesis.
There are many stories at the beginning of the Bible that deal with this kind of envy. In fact, Esau and Jacob is a tale of envy. Ishmael envies Isaac. Joseph has a coat of many colors, and his brothers envy him so much that they sell him into slavery in Egypt.
And yet, despite its long biblical history of causing grief, envy was left off the early list of sins. The 4th century monk Evagrius, who wrote down the original list of vices, had a total of 8 temptations for his brethren to avoid, but made no mention of envy.
That's something that more commonly exists in a culture where possessions and status are the definitions of who you are and what you are. So there's a kind of evolution as things begin to move out from the monastic context elsewhere.
When the church made the sin of vainglory a part of the sin of pride, the list of 8 became 7 deadly sins. 7 was a powerful number for the church. From the 7 days of creation to the 7 hills of Rome. Yet envy still wasn't one of the 7 deadly sins. Until Gregory the Great, who became Pope in 590 AD, saw a world of political intrigue filled with rival barbarians clashing over the remnants of the Roman Empire. Gregory wrote, "From envy arises hatred, joy at our neighbor's misfortune, and grief for his prosperity." Envy was alive in the world. Gregory wanted envy, invidia in Latin, on the list of deadly sins. But tradition dictated there be just 7 sins. By folding apathy into the sin of sadness, the vice called sloth was formed and made room for envy. The sin of envy became part of Pope Gregory's list and an inspiration for medieval artists like the Italian writer Dante Alighieri. In Dante's Purgatory, the spirits of the envious wander in a wasteland, their eyes sewn shut with iron threads.
This is because the sin was most commonly committed through the eyes.
Some not only felt the sin of envy, they took pleasure in their enemy's pain. Dante didn't have a word for this pernicious side effect of envy, but the Germans do. It's called Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude is a German term that refers to finding joy in the sorrow or misfortune of others. Literally, Freude, joy, and Schaden, sorrow or misfortune.
In the book business, you hear somebody gets an enormous advance, and of course you're envious. Any author's envious and thinks, oh, like how come I can't get a huge amount of money for my book, or why did they get that much money? If a couple years later the book comes out and you hear it didn't sell very well, the publisher lost money, it's like, One of my favorite quotes about envy is from the writer Gore Vidal, and he says, "Whenever a friend succeeds, a little something in me dies."
Every culture seems to struggle with envy. But have some civilizations given in to the deadly sin? The 7 deadly sins are thought of as pathways to damnation. Of these sins, one of the most insidious is thought to be that of envy, at least according to Catholic doctrine. But there have always been other opinions.
In some cultures, envy is considered a fairly natural and inevitable expression that successful people simply have to plan upon.
Around 500 BC, the Greeks thought of envy not as a deadly sin, but as a political tactic.
The common people wrote the name of a person they would like to be removed from the city on a shard of pottery called an ostracon, and that's the origin of our word ostracism. And if enough people voted for one person, that person was ostracized from Athens for a period of 10 years. The purpose of ostracism was in part to keep people from getting too much political power or to punish people who in fact behaved badly. But there was an element that allowed envy to be the motive as well. Envy, any grudge, any whim could be expressed against a person by writing their name on the shard of pottery and putting it in, and they were gone.
Officially, there was no shame to being ostracized. However, if a citizen didn't leave Athens within 10 days, the penalty was death. One prominent citizen voted into exile was Aristides the Just, so-called because of his high moral qualities. It was exactly these positive attributes that turned the envious against him.
The story goes, Aristides saw a citizen writing his name on a shard of pottery and went up and said, "Who is this Aristides, and why would you want to ostracize him?" And the response was, "He hasn't done anything wrong, but I'm always hearing about how wonderful and noble he is, and it really irritates me."
At the same time the Athenians were exiling their most noble citizens, the lotus of Buddhism was blooming in India. For Buddhists, the Western concept of envy is a combination of two words, one meaning covetousness and one meaning jealousy. Both conditions are roadblocks on the path to enlightenment and nirvana.
What's happening in envy is that we're stuck on an image of ourselves as incapable, incompetent, and we tend to project our aspirations and our competence onto others and then say, if only I had it.
The Buddha taught that envious souls are reborn into the violent realm of Titans.
The Titans, always feeling inadequate, they're always being driven. Whatever they achieve never feels like a success. Nothing is ever good enough because they're stuck on this internal sense of inadequacy that's spoiling all the good things that might come their way. From a Buddhist point of view, always emphasizing the optimistic side, one person can produce a good result, then one should be happy about that, because if we're really understanding that correctly, we're understanding that, well, if he can do it, I can do it too. And maybe I can even learn, piggyback, or maybe I don't need to do what I wanted to do because he did it and I can just enjoy the results.
While the Buddhists view envy as a dead end, according to other religions, some kinds of envy could actually encourage spiritual growth.
Envy in Judaism is actually not a sin. It can, in fact, be a spur to something good. It depends what kind of envy. So there is a statement in rabbinic literature that the envy of scholars increases wisdom, because if you know more than me and I want to know more, I'll grow in wisdom. Envy only becomes a sin when it means that what you have, I'm going to take from you.
In the Middle East, many have taken to referring to this type of envy as the evil eye. It's the hateful stare the envious give those whom they bitterly resent.
Jesus himself even referred to the evil eye in one of the parables, the parable of the vineyards and the laborers who were less successful threw the evil eye at the successful laborer.
For thousands of years, the best way to defeat the stare of the evil eye has been to stare back with a special charm.
Anyone who's traveled in parts of the Middle East or in Greece or on the Mediterranean sees these blue eyes everywhere. They're hanging at the entrances to homes and businesses. They're melted into the sidewalk. They're on your tea glass. And we refer to it in the West as the evil eye, but it's actually not the evil eye. It's warding off the evil eye.
In the 7th century AD, a powerful new religion arose in the Middle East. Although Islam challenged Christianity both spiritually and politically, the popes might have agreed with Muhammad's attitude toward the 7 deadly sins, including envy.
The Quran refers to envy as hasad, and definitely specifies envy as a sin, and a major sin. There's a teaching of Muhammad that says that envy destroys good deeds as fire destroys dry wood.
Beware of good fortune, for envy follows close behind.
You would add on to, that's a great car, you would say, Masha Allah, which means it's what God has willed. And that's like a code word meaning, and I'm not jealous, or I'm not envious.
Around the world, envy has gone hand in hand with evil magic. Just open any book of fairy tales.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs very explicitly describes envy as being at the heart of the story. The queen is always asking her magic mirror, who is the fairest of them all, and the mirror, of course, says that she is, until Snow White becomes the fairest in the land. The exact words of the Brothers Grimm is that the queen turned yellow and green with envy.
What's fascinating about the Cinderella myth is that just by being good, you can arouse the envy or the enmity of others. It's a very powerful story. You can find it in China, Japan, Korea, Africa, among the indigenous American populations. But in all these stories, it's a person who's just trying to be good, who runs afoul of the envy of others and the resentment of others, and sometimes has a heroic rescue at the end, but sometimes not.
Literature can give us the vicarious experience of feeling envious or being envied. Religious tradition can give envy a face, the face of a demon. Throughout history, writers have tried to turn the 7 deadly sins from moral concepts and challenges to characters, to put a face on these aspects of evil. The power of the sin of envy is reflected in one demonic image. The Bible calls it Leviathan, a sea monster of unimaginable size and fierceness, who can only be controlled by God himself. In the late 13th century, Thomas Aquinas equated the creature with the proud figure of Satan. Then, in 1589, the notorious German witch hunter, Bishop Peter Binsfeld, named Leviathan as the demon in charge of envy, with countless minor demons at his beck and call.
And their job is to tempt human beings, to try to get them to commit sins.
While Binsfeld's matching of demons with the 7 deadly sins was never approved by the Vatican, it remained popular with amateur demonologists.
Well, human beings have always imagined that the world is populated by invisible spirits. Jewish angelology and demonology was a big subject. What relationship do they have to human beings? What are their powers?
In the Old Testament book of Samuel, King Saul fell under the influence of an unnamed evil spirit. The king found relief in the music of David's harp. Ironically, when Saul made the young man his trusted aide, Saul's heart was possessed by a new and stronger sin, envy.
Saul very much favored David, but when they started to make up songs about how David had slain tens of thousands where Saul had only killed thousands, this started to bother Saul.
Saul envies David because David is a star. David is everything that Saul hasn't managed to achieve. He has the people's love. He has the promise of a bright future.
The parallel to this might be a CEO who has a subordinate who's something of an upstart and who's getting too much attention. And so then they might try to undo that subordinate. In the case of Saul, Saul really did try to undo David.
In fact, Saul tries to kill David with his spear, but David survives the king's murderous envy.
He has God's favor, and Saul has this powerful bitterness that will, in the end his life.
As much as anything, the tragedy of Saul and David is a story of the corrosive power of envy in politics and government. In 44 BC, the political envy of a small group of conspirators toppled a government and changed the destiny of Rome. Gaius Cassius and Marcus Brutus led a plot to assassinate the dictator Julius Caesar.
Cassius is envious of Caesar, and then he appeals to Brutus. Brutus's motives are that he has the concern with the well-being of the Republic, so he does have a sort of loftier motive, but he's played or manipulated by Cassius.
Dante, in his epic vision of hell, sentences Cassius, along with Brutus and Christ's betrayer Judas, to the very center of hell.
In Dante's Inferno, at the lowest level, you have a punishment being handed out to some of the great betrayers, those who betrayed Caesar and Jesus.
The envious Cassius is to be gnawed by Satan until the end of time. But the literary Cassius may not be an accurate portrayal of the historical assassin. The real Cassius might have considered himself a patriot. What some viewed as the sin of envy, he may have seen as justice.
There is some connection between envy and injustice and grievance. But there's always a challenge as to what is the line that should be drawn in terms of what qualifies as a genuine grievance, what qualifies as a genuine injustice. And I suppose if you're on the receiving end of the injustice, you're quick to point out where the lines are.
1789, a revolution in France promised liberty, equality, and fraternity.
A number of philosophers have described revolutions as sometimes being motivated by envy. The common people who are not allowed to share in the wealth of the aristocracy might be motivated to have what the aristocrats have, or to pull down the aristocrats so there's no longer this gulf separating the two social classes.
The French Revolution would ultimately lead to the Reign of Terror. 40,000 people sent to the guillotine, many for simply being aristocrats. While others are betrayed by envious rivals, the revolution devoured its own as the crowds reveled in Schadenfreude. In 1917, another revolution overthrew the Russian Tsar. Over the next 60 years, communism would spread across the world, murdering millions, but promising fairness and equality. Yet envy thrives in a worker's paradise as easily as the serpent in Eden.
Socialism's concerned with everyone being kept at the same level and sharing of fruits of society. The downside, though, is if the most skilled and most talented members of a society are not at liberty to pursue their skills and talents without the fear that other people will resent what they achieve, attack them as a result of their success, it could inhibit the society as a whole.
The difference between capitalist and communist society appeared in high relief in divided post-war Germany.
Germany is divided between a kind of extreme socialist society and a free market capitalist society. And in Germany, when Germany is divided east and west, and you have the same populations of people, but under very different systems, and you look at the productivity and the prosperity of these two nations, you could see the lack of productivity, lack of wealth pretty substantial.
Revolutionary governments and dictatorships have tried to destroy envy and failed. While some believe that sin is a choice, others say it's hardwired. The 7 deadly sins. For centuries, they've shaped society's behavior. There are some who question whether humans are predestined to commit the insidiously desirous sin of envy. In the early 20th century, a new scientific philosopher, Dr. Sigmund Freud, claimed to have discovered a new kind of envy. It was his belief that the sin of envy was caused not by demons, but by social and sexual drives as terrifying as any devil. According to the creator of psychoanalysis, every boy desires his mother and wants to kill the father he envies. Freud calls this the Oedipus complex. As for girls, Freud claimed that once they realize they're built differently than boys, they become filled with a desire for what they can never have. Specifically, Freud wrote, the little girl becomes envious of the penis. This envy reaches its highest point in the wish that she also should be a boy.
In Freud's scheme, girls envy boys to want to acquire a penis for themselves by associating themselves with a man. Now, this notion strikes many people as implausible, and it strikes me as implausible, but it had a very strong effect on popular culture.
After Freud's death, his notion of the sin of envy became all the rage in the United States, from psychiatrist couches to cocktail parties and corporate boardrooms.
Penis envy was used in a way to keep women in their place. A woman who was at all ambitious, who wanted to break out of the traditional and rather constraining role of women in the 1950s, was sometimes dismissed by being told that instead of being a proper woman, that she was in some psychopathological way trying to be a man because she had penis envy. And it was a way of telling women, don't even go there.
The American psychiatrist Karen Horney countered penis envy with her own theory of womb envy. According to Horney, men envied women's ability to bring forth life and sublimated this envy by working hard at their careers. In the early 21st century, it was hoped that applied neuroscience could determine where the sin of envy lurked in the human brain. Some studies have tried to measure the aspect of envy called Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude is really represented in the brain in a very specific neural region, and interestingly, it's the same region that cares about rewards. So it suggests that this might be a very basic phenomena in the human biology.
Professors from Harvard and the University of Miami asked over 250 people, which scenario would you prefer? Which would you choose? Let's say you make $50,000 a year and everybody around you is making $25,000, or you can make $100,000 a year, but everybody around you is making $200,000 a year. And which would you want? And more than half of the people said, okay, I'll take the $50,000. I'll give up the $100,000, the six-figure salary. I'll take the $50,000 as long as I'm making twice as much as everybody else. And it really shows how much relativity matters to us.
How long has envy been part of mankind's emotional makeup? A study at the Yerkes Institute in Atlanta tried to catch envy in action along a 35-million-year-old branch of the human evolutionary tree among capuchin monkeys. Pairs of capuchin monkeys were trained to exchange tokens for a food reward. At first, both got cucumbers, but then one of the monkeys got something tastier, a grape.
When the subject monkey gets a cucumber and he saw the other guy get a cucumber, he thinks, oh, cucumber, this is great. He eats it, he's excited. However, when the subject monkey gets a cucumber, but the other guy got a grape, now the subject monkey gets very upset. The subject monkey will actually reject the cucumber. He just sort of throws it away and doesn't eat it, which is shocking. I think that the cucumber studies actually are the best evidence that primates really get envious of each other.
But according to some scientists, the sin of envy could be a positive evolutionary trait.
You see another monkey coming home with 5 nuts. When you go out and forage, you only get 3 nuts. You might be really envious and sort of angry and say, oh, I really got to get those extra 2 nuts. So the idea is that envy might actually be a good mechanism for helping organisms figure out what kinds of rewards are possible in a given environment.
35 million years along the evolutionary tree. Envy certainly seems hardwired in the environment of high school.
We have drama among kids and fighting for unnecessary little things, and so I've encountered envy before.
High school's the time in your life you try to figure out who you are, and you just go through different things and you look at other people.
You've got the girls who are envious of looks and guys who are envious of the other guys with the girls. There's always the kid who's got everything.
Like someone coming in with new clothes or something, or say a new iPod or a new phone, people look at that and they're like, oh, I want that, I need to go out and buy that, or maybe I could just steal it from them.
If humanity is inherently envious, then what has become of society? Has vice become virtue? The 7 deadly sins, 7 temptations to be avoided at all moral cost. But in today's society, sins like envy make the world go round.
Work hard, work your way up. You can have or be anything or anyone that you want to in this country, and that's what the whole culture is based on. And the ugly underbelly of that is, for that to all be working, you have to experience envy. You have to experience keeping up with the Joneses.
The sin of envy may be the machine by which our country runs. In the U.S., consumer spending makes up 2/3 of the economy. Try maintaining that if everybody's happy with what they've got.
Wealth societies try to actually encourage competition amongst people because you need this as a base to generate the wealth. And so we raise people to be competitive in our society, and as a consequence, we may be fostering more envy.
One of the best ways to foster envy is through advertising.
We still see an ad and think, I really do need a bigger car. Or, wait a second, my neighbor got that and I need one too. Keeping up with the Joneses and inspiring envy is just an oldie but a goodie in the advertising agency. They have been using this for 100 years. It works every time.
Some ads make you want what others have, but some of the most effective are the ones that sell envy directly.
The granddaddy of them all is this 1915 Cadillac ad. And it talked about, oh, when you accomplish something big, it sets tongues a-wagging. The subliminal message was, buy a Cadillac and you will be the object of envy. And it might have been the first example of an ad that outright admitted that not only do we experience envy and so we might want something that other people have, but that we want others to envy us. We want to have something that shows that we are successful and to inspire somebody else to even not like us because of it.
If you're searching for the sin of envy today, you don't have to look any further than your own office. Nothing new there. Aristotle wrote about workplace envy in the 4th century BC.
I believe he said something along the lines that it's the pottery makers who envy the other pottery makers. So people are engaged in the same line of work, the ones who are much more threatened by others and are needing to compete with a rival who's in the same domain.
What was true in ancient Greece holds true in today's office place.
It turns out that 3/4 of employees will report that they've witnessed envy within the past month. About 1/3 of employees report that they witnessed undermining, significant, serious efforts to undermine rivals.
They might engage in backbiting or backhanded compliments.
The sin of envy can even lead to workplace sabotage.
In work situations, fortunately, most envy is fairly benign. It's fairly petty. People tend to get over it. Although I suppose sabotage is done in such a way that you're not supposed to be able to detect it.
The world of modern technology allows for a certain amount of voyeurism, creating easy outlets for the sin of envy.
We live right now in a world that's just dripping with an envy culture. And we have this bizarre belief that somehow my pulling your house down makes mine look better, which is really irrational and psychotic, at its deepest.
The form of the sin of envy called schadenfreude sometimes takes celebrities as its target.
In terms of examples of schadenfreude, Martha Stewart's probably an outstanding recent example of a person who went to trial and into jail time for insider trading, and there was a certain amount of satisfaction that was detectable among people who felt that she represented a very high standard of perfection.
There's an element of unfairness there, and people also enjoy seeing those people pulled down a bit.
The core problem with the sin of envy is that it's insatiable.
Even within the upper classes, the stratification happens. It's the school lunchroom all over again. I read about this guy with a 100-foot yacht being at a boat show in Florida, and a 130-foot yacht pulls up next to him and he said, well, mine felt like a dinghy. And of course, when the 400-and-some foot yachts were constructed, some Saudi came out with like a 500-and-some footer. So it just never ends. You're always on this treadmill.
Yacht envy may seem like harmless entertainment, but like every other kind of envy, there may be a very serious social cost.
Envy is all about relative status, so having brand name items or designer items, driving an expensive car and these sorts of things are ways of flaunting your status. These are ways of boasting. And boasting is, if you think about it, a form of aggression. So it's questionable whether or not this is a wise thing for society to do.
If it's going to be the case that some nations are going to possess more of goods that are increasingly scarce, there might be reason for concern that envy from the people of other nations could result in all kinds of hostilities and conflicts around the planet. We think about water, we think about food. Nations who have these resources may want to think about how to minimize the envy of their neighbors. As we look into the future, we can find things to be worried about.
The sin of envy can be difficult to define. Without it, there would have been no progress. With it, there can be no peace, or so it seems. And throughout history, going back to Sigmund Freud, to Dante, to Pope Gregory, to the Roman goddess of envy herself, the green-eyed monster remains a deadly temptation to all.